All right. It looks like most people are here and connected, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to session 3 of our Staff Satisfaction Surveys Learning Collaborative, a special Thursday edition of our Learning Collaborative, and we're so glad you are here with us today. As you guys know, I'm Suzanne Spear. I'm the Senior Director of Workforce Development here at ACU, and I'm joined by my awesome and amazing colleagues. Today, Helen Ray Vernier, one of our training specialists here at ACU, and then Mariah Blake, who is our program manager. Just some housekeeping items. We always like to go through these as we get started at the top of our time together. So this session is being recorded, and it is going to be shared on our discussion board. So if you want to share it with other folks on your team, or listen to it again, or go back and listen to it, or if you miss it, you can go back and listen to it again. And so that is there on the discussion board. Please be as present as possible. We know how we all have a lot of things going on, but it's great if you're able to turn on your camera, interact with your peers, and let us see your shining faces. Feel free to chat or unmute yourself during our session together, ask questions. We will have some group sharing time where we'll go out into breakout groups. And so feel free to ask questions as we go along, either in the chat or verbally. We will have a Q&A time at the end, but feel free to put those in chat as we go along and go through our presentation. As you guys know, Mariah is here to help you with any technical questions or difficulties that you might have, so feel free to either message her in the chat or send her an email at mblake@clinicians.org, and she will get you pointed in the right direction. Finally, please make sure that you complete your evaluation at the end of the session. We appreciate it. It helps us continuously improve our process and experience for you all, and it also HRSA also enjoys everyone giving them their data so we can report on all of our activities. All right, so our Learning Collaborative goals. Ultimately, we want you all to implement and respond to a staff satisfaction survey. Obviously, during this time together, we're really sort of in the planning process of doing that. And then once our Learning Collaborative ends, then you'll go ahead and do those things. So, really throughout that process, building those process and a strategy for doing that. And finally, we are building relationships. Not only are we building relationships with our team and figuring out how that's going to work at our own health center, but also we're hearing and learning from our fellow cohort members in the Learning Collaborative. And you all know how we're doing all these things. And by the end of this, it is our hope that you will have the tools needed to implement and respond to a staff satisfaction survey. All right, so what are we doing today? So we're going to have a quick icebreaker, a fun little icebreaker, and then we are going to dive into homework review and reflection in our breakout groups, where you guys are just going to sort of think about, discuss all of the items that you went over during as you went through and completed your homework assignment last week on action plans for implementing staff satisfaction surveys. Then we're going to move into our time with our guest presenter. So excited to hear from her today. And then we'll do wrap up and next steps, answer questions, and present our homework for this time. All right, so we're going to go to Mentimeter for our icebreaker today. You can either go to menti.com and enter 5344-0055 in a browser, or you can go to the poll that Helen put in chat. Thank you so much, Helen. Or you can, third way, you can take a picture of the QR code and answer it there. And with that, I am going to stop sharing so Helen can share our Mentimeter polls. All right. So a little fun thing. So I believe last time we did cute animals. Is that right, Helen? Okay, yeah, so right. This time we're going to do something totally different. We're going to do seasons, because it's, the seasons are almost getting ready to change in some places. So our first one is spring or fall. What's the code? So the code is 5344-0055 or Yash, you can click the link that Helen put into the chat. We are in a dead heat here. We've got 7 for spring and 7 for fall. So some people like it as we are emerging from the winter. Awesome, Yash, thank you for letting me know. And then we have some people who like the fall and the ending of summer and moving in all the beautiful colors that come along with it. In some parts of the country, right? Some of us are in parts of the country that you don't really have that. But anyway, it's fun to see what people like either. Awesome. So fall pulled barely ahead with 8. Awesome. So our next one is summer or winter. Do you enjoy the crispness of the winter, or do you like the heat of the summer? And again, it's probably hotter in some places than others, as we are have a bunch of folks from around the country. So our seasons look different to one another, especially if you're in Florida, where you don't have much of a winter, but it does get pretty hot there. All right, so it looks like for this one, we have more folks who enjoy summer more than winter. So awesome. Thanks so much for participating in our fun little poll together. Awesome. Okay, well, I am going to go back, share my PowerPoint. And during this time, we are going to go into our breakout groups again. So Mariah is going to put us in just a minute. She's going to put us into our breakout groups. We're going to give you 10 minutes to chat with your colleagues and just talk about homework questions. What is something that you learned about during the completion of this assignment? What is one challenge that you think that you might have when implementing a staff satisfaction survey? And if you've done, and they're all ones. So 1, 1, 1. That was awesome. Nice typo there that I didn't quite catch. And if you've done a staff satisfaction survey before, what is one thing you will do differently with this survey? So we're going to go ahead. Mariah's going to go, and thank you for putting those in the chat there, Helen. That's awesome. So we're going to go put you in the rooms for 10 minutes. We're going to come back at just about 1:20 Eastern time. So you have, again, about 10 minutes. And with that, I hope you enjoy your time with your colleagues and learn and hear about what they did with their homework. Any questions before we go in there? I know we're joining things now, joining rooms now, but feel free to put it in chat if you have any questions. All right, see you guys in a little bit. All right, folks are coming back into the main room. You've been beamed back into our main room. Hope you all enjoyed time with your colleagues reflecting on homework for action planning for implementing your staff satisfaction surveys. All right, and I'm going to give it just a minute because it looks like we've got probably about 10 more people who are still needing to come back into this room. So I don't want to go into our time together. All right, most are coming back. Okay, great. Now I see our numbers going up. Okay, great, perfect, awesome. All right, I think most everybody's back, so I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving so we don't lose our time for our presenter. All right, I am all over the place today. Well, I don't know what's going on with I literally have no idea what's going on with my computer right now. But we are going to move over into our time where we have another guest presenter today. We're so thrilled to have Tammy Green with Tammy Green Consulting with us today. Tammy has her Master's of Public Health, and she's also a certified coach. She has been in the healthcare industry for over 25 years. And most recently, before she started her own consulting business this fall, she was the CEO of Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center in Anchorage, Alaska. And we're just thrilled to have her joining us to really dive into the topic of how we're going to respond to staff satisfaction surveys. So last time we talked about really implementing them, the questions that go into it, and all of that. And Tammy's going to take us on the journey of how we really respond to them and what we do after we gather that information. And with that, I will turn it over to Tammy. Thanks so much for being here, Tammy.
Oh, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. And first of all, I want to make sure everybody can hear me, right? So thumbs up. Okay, great. Well, first, I want to say thank you for all the work that you do every single day. I know, how difficult the work is, and especially with COVID now and all the things that, we've had to adjust to. So even though I'm not the CEO any longer, I still feel affiliated fondly and for always with the health center movement for sure. So thank you. And thank you, Suzanne, for having me speak today. So I'm going to share my screen. And I am not the most technologically savvy person in the world, but I've learned a lot over these last few months of doing Zoom on my own. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Awesome. Whew.
Yep.
It's like the first big thing there.
Good to go.
As Suzanne said, I just left the role of CEO at Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center and started my own consulting business, doing consulting and executive coaching. That's always been my love. And so this work around employee engagement and satisfaction is near and dear to my heart. And I hope that what I'm going to share with you today will be informational. Hope it will inspire you a little bit. And I'm happy to answer questions as we get to the end. Suzanne's going to help me kind of watch the chat box. I'm trying to keep the questions to the end, but if something comes up that she feels like I should answer right away, I'm definitely going to do it. So without any further ado, let's get started. So I love the title. It says, "Knowledge becomes wisdom only after it has been put to practical use." And I think one of the things that happens, and I've seen this in my career, I've been in public health and academia and everything, all kinds of different areas of healthcare. And one of the things I find is that we love to collect data in lots of ways, but we don't always, I think, use it in the most meaningful way. So I'm hopeful that today I'm going to share with you some of the nuggets that you can walk away with in terms of our experience with employee engagement surveys and satisfaction surveys. So just really quickly, Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center, where I was the CEO, we're the largest health center in the state of Alaska. And we had somewhere around 160, 175 employees, served about 12,000 patients annually. Full service, all the things, as they say, but really a cornerstone in our community when it comes to serving all the folks in our community who otherwise wouldn't have access to healthcare. One interesting note is that folks are always surprised how diverse we are, but every month we paid for translation services, as all of you do on some level, and we translate between 45 and 65 different languages monthly. So it just kind of gives you a little bit of breadth to the diversity in our community and in our health center. So in 2015, when I started as the CEO, one of the things I wanted to look at was what they had done historically around staff satisfaction and engagement. And what I found was that there was kind of, bits and sparks and pieces of it here and there, but overall, there wasn't a lot of really representative data. And even more challenging was that the staff really had a negative kind of attitude about it because there was concerns about confidentiality and whether or not the responses that they had been providing were truly confidential based on some of the things that had happened. When I took over as CEO, the organization had been through like 3 CEOs, and so there was a lot of chaos and just lots of distrust, lots of things going on. And so I felt like it was going to be really important to really understand the organization from my perspective before I did anything. And I think as a CEO, and this is just my perspective, that one of my most important jobs, or the most important job of a CEO, is to really understand the culture of the organization and really figure out, how what you're doing as a leader is either modeling and really promoting the culture that you're trying to achieve, or are you or your executive team, are you engaging in behaviors that are not productive or positive. So one of the things that we wanted to do before we even launched into creating this employee satisfaction and engagement survey was to take the time to really kind of socialize with staff. First of all, what does it mean to have an organizational culture? Really trying to share the vision of how this new approach was going to be and really kind of getting feedback. So we spent that first year gathering a lot of data, trying to understand where folks were coming from, so that when we did launch the survey, that folks, had an understanding around what was going to be happening. So we administered the first baseline survey in June of 2016. And then right after that, we also did our first ever organizational culture assessment. So with those two things, we looked at all that data. And then in that fall, when we were able to have all staff trainings in person, we had our first all staff training event to talk about the data, what it meant, and then how we as leaders were going to use that data going forward. Another important key factor, I think, when you're looking at employee engagement survey and satisfaction data, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a second. We talked about, we have what we call employee engagement survey, and then we also added satisfaction survey questions, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So when you hear me talk about employee engagement, that's what I'm talking about. So as we as an executive team started to look at this and really, figure out what are we going to do with this data, the first thing was, how do we as a leadership team create a shared vision and also shared language? One of the things that I think it's really important as a leader is that, when you're communicating and trying to share your vision, that you really have this opportunity to create shared language, because without shared language, it's really hard to create the vision that then can kind of get cascaded out through the organization. So we spent a fair amount of time at the executive level talking about shared vision language, so that then as it started to filter down into the organization, there was this thread that was still connected to what we as the executives were really intentionally setting forward. And so when we looked at embarking on this, it wasn't just to collect data around, learning, kind of what was happening in the organization. Obviously, that was super critical, but we also wanted to use this approach as more of a transformational approach rather than transactional. And what I mean by that is, just rather than collecting data and going, here's what's happening, but really using it to address some higher level organizational needs. And so when we started looking at key factors that were associated with engagement, we wanted to see what those were and how they linked back to our organization's mission. So key things for us were productivity, retention, absenteeism, presenteeism. If you've never heard the word presenteeism, basically that means you're present, but you're not really present. And so that's kind of the really short version of presenteeism. There's a lot of literature around there if you wanted to look at it. And then really importantly, the ability to recruit top talent and retain top talent. So also we emphasized that we wanted to make sure that the measurement strategy was meaningful, but most importantly, that it was actionable in nature and not just transactional, like I mentioned before. So we started looking at, how did we want to do this? What were things that we wanted to look at? And prior to coming into the role as CEO at Anchorage Neighborhood Health Center, I had worked for a very large health system on the West Coast called Providence Health and Services. If you're on the West Coast, you probably have heard of them. They're pretty huge by now. And I had been involved in some of the work around, my title was the System Director for Employee Wellbeing and Engagement. And so had an opportunity to really, look at this work from a different perspective. And so now coming into this role as CEO, I thought, okay, what are some of the things that I want to bring that I learned, but also some of the ways that maybe I want to change things as to how we do this. So we wanted to focus on holistic employee engagement and satisfaction, meaning we wanted to look at total rewards, which usually when you hear that term, and you folks that are in HR know that term, but for folks who might not know, organizations talk about total rewards as their benefit package, PTO, retirement plan, education benefits, all of those things that go into and pay into what they call the total rewards. So we wanted to look at those things. We wanted to look at leadership. We also wanted to look at learning and development and how that was going to be a part of this culture that collectively we wanted to grow and build. Excuse me, we wanted to make sure we were using best practice questions and measurement methodology so that we were producing data that was really giving us good information. So one of the things that we did was we looked at surveys that we had used at Providence and some of the other places that I had been as well. We also looked at Gallup, they're kind of the gold standard in some of these places. And we created our own questions based on some of those best practices. So I wouldn't say for 100% that our questions are fully validated, but they've served us really well. And I'll share those with you shortly. So this is where I was getting ready to tell you, we had a little bit of a kind of a bifurcation of the way that we looked at engagement. So we created two sets of questions. We created the employee engagement questions, which we delivered quarterly, and we called it our pulse survey. And the idea for me there was that, oftentimes that if they're just done annually, there's so much time in between that it's often hard to kind of understand where some of the opportunities for change are in that space. So we decided to do it quarterly, and then we also annually added in the fall time period where we're doing employee engagement, the satisfaction survey, which was more around pay and benefits and some of the things that weren't so temporal that changed more readily. And I'll share those in a second. This is just a little graphic that I've used to help people kind of understand a little bit more about what are the factors that go into employee satisfaction and engagement. And I'm sure none of this is like rocket science to all of you, but I always think of it as the core is mission. And particularly folks in the community health center world, that is what drew us to this work most likely in the beginning. And it's also what most likely keeps us there in the work. And so starting with mission kind of, all the way up, sense of purpose, growth potential, the workplace culture, relationships that you have with each other, your colleagues, and with your supervisors. And we also know that, the relationship that folks have with their direct supervisor is one of the most critical aspects in terms of whether people decide to stay or leave in an organization. And then the third, and the top two are, work schedule flexibility there, and pay and benefits. And oftentimes you hear people say, well, it's not about the money. So what I've learned over time is it is about the money to a certain extent. So you have to make sure that you're, addressing compensation and benefits in the best way that you can for what your organization, can afford. But when people say that, I often just, say that might not be the main driver, but we certainly don't want to lose sight of it as well. Okay, let's see. Okay. So I wanted to share with you some of the questions, or all of the questions that we have been using over the last, several years. And we have had, we've done quarterly surveys since we started. We only missed one quarter, and I bet you can guess which one that was. And that was that was March of 2020, when a few other things were happening and we weren't unable to collect data at that time. But these are the questions that we came up with for our engagement survey questions. And I'm just going to kind of, I'm not going to like make you listen to me read all of them, but I'm going to point out a couple that I think we had some focus on as we were looking at our data. But you'll notice that, and by the way, you'll get the slide deck. So just, I'm sure you knew that, but I wanted to just reconfirm. So if you notice on the questions with the little asterisk, those were the questions from our original 2016 questions. And over time, one of the things that's been really interesting and very exciting is that we've used the data that we've collected from the surveys to also use it as an iteration of the survey itself. So as we collected more information and we learned new things, we used that data to kind of add to some of the initial questions that we had. So if you look at this, you can see all of these that I'm talking about that are asterisks that were part of the original data set. So these are things that, are not rocket science questions, but I think if you look at them, you start to see the importance of really trying to get a pulse on where your employees are at any given time. So, most days I feel happy at work. You feel valued for the work that you do each day, having meaningful relationships, how they view their supervisor as a mentor. Again, as we know, that relationship with the supervisor is super important in terms of whether people stay or whether they choose to leave. Clearly understand what my supervisor expects of me. This is one of the questions, some of the data that early on we were finding that people didn't have a good understanding of that. So that was something that as an executive team, we took that, we started looking at it, working with HR, figuring out how do we better equip our supervisors so that they can make sure that their folks know what the expectations are. Do they have the right tools and support to do the job? And then this number 7, in the past 2 weeks, I've received recognition for a job well done. This is this is one that we have really spent a lot of time on over the course of the 6 years. And the data was never bad. I mean, it was usually in, the 70, to 80 kind of percentile of folks that, felt like that they had received recognition. But it was always one of the ones that was lower. So we spent a lot of time taking that data, working with managers and supervisors, and really helping them understand the importance of authentically being able to recognize their employees for a job well done. And what we would see is that, when we would focus on this the next quarter, then that data would go up. And then if we didn't kind of make sure we were still attending to that, sometimes it would start to go down. So this kind of like pulse survey data gives you this opportunity to look again in more of real-time space to see what you're doing and how it's impacting the employees. Okay, the next set, excuse me, yeah. And then these are just continued questions. Number 10 was our only question that was kind of an inverse measure. The rest of them were kind of on a, the positive side, but it said if you were offered a 10% raise from another organization, would you consider going? And so that one was really important for us too, to start to understand kind of that value and power of what compensation was related to versus people just being happy at work. So anyway, you can kind of see through some of the rest of these, but these were the questions. And you'll notice on question number 14, I feel safe and secure at work. This was a newer question, and that was actually the result of, we had, I don't know, a few years ago, some qualitative comments that came back of some of our employees feeling like they didn't feel like we were taking their safety at where it should be. And I'll share with you some of the things that we did as a result of that. But they were not feeling, again, that they were safe at work. And so they brought to our attention several things that we were able to create some action items around and change. And I'll share those with you a little bit later. The 115, I feel the work I do supports the mission, vision, and values. This one always rates like one of our top scores, which I think is, again, reflective of the population of folks who choose to work in a community health center. Let's see. So then what we wanted to do was to annually add some of what are more what I think of as maybe what you guys have had more conversation around satisfaction questions. And so these are added to the annual survey in the fall. So again, these are things that are a little bit more or a little bit less temporal and aren't as subject to change as some of the other ones that we just looked at. But it was important to start to understand how employees were feeling about communication and whether or not they were feeling like they were getting the right communication. And so over my time in my career in leadership roles, communication is always something that people either feel like they don't get enough of, or they have too much of it and they don't understand it. So this one is always one of those that provides directionality, but we also have to kind of understand kind of maybe what's going on at that time. So you can read through some of these questions that are, again, that what we added to our annual satisfaction survey data. And then we had the last 5 here are really related to what I kind of was referring to earlier around what I think of as total rewards. Are you satisfied with your pay, your salary, the medical, dental, vision, insurance, the retirement plan, paid time off, and then that overall question of pay and benefits. And this was another question when I first got there. The benefit plans were not that great, and I had come from an organization where I'd had a lot of opportunity to shape some of that. And so we worked really diligently, my chief HR officer and I, to really work with our brokers and to try to find the best solution that we could and what we could afford for our employees. And that did start to make a big difference on this survey as our employee benefits started to shift and change. And then one of the other things that we did that I think is also important is we added additional qualitative questions, because we were getting a lot of, quantitative data. And then we were like, I want to know more about this, or I need to kind of understand this a little bit more. So we started, kind of based on some of the quantitative data, starting to look at what are some of those qualitative questions that we could ask. So the questions are, do you have the tools and resources to do your job effectively? If not, what do you need? And, kind of offering that up as an opportunity to share with us. What is working well that ANHC should continue to do? What is not working well that ANHC should do differently or stop doing? And what else would you like to share? Some really interesting data came out of some of those questions. So I know you guys have already talked about, kind of the process. I just feel like it's important to share with you how our process works, so that when I talk about some of the outcomes, you'll have a little bit better understanding. So our data, we collected it over a 2-week period of time. We used this SurveyMonkey. And then the way that we did it was we had approximately 5 times that we sent out an email. The first email came from me as the CEO, with really kind of this, understanding of, or trying to help folks understand why we're doing this, why it was important for their voice to be heard, and then, send out the link. And then throughout that period of time, we would pulse, as we looked at the numbers that we were getting, we would pulse the emails kind of appropriately, to make sure we were getting our responses. And over that period of time, we have always had at least 100 responses, and anywhere up to 120. So I've always felt like we've had a really good data set that is, maybe not 100% representative, but I feel like it's very directionally representative, and it allowed us to really look at trend data over time with an eye from the perspective that, getting that very consistent response rate really allowed us to have confidence in the data that we were getting. And then it was obviously anonymous. We went to great lengths to help people understand that. We did ask participants to identify which division, really which C-suite executive they formally rolled all the way up to. People were really, pretty okay with that. We had some people who didn't identify, but for the most part, folks were very amenable and open to saying what division they reported up to. But the other thing that's important to note is we never took any of that data. We never divided it or looked at it in any other way other than in the aggregate. So no leader could look at just their data at the way that we were doing it. It was all still aggregate, organizational wide. Now, I'm sure if you have a larger organization and you had some of those really nice, clean boundaries around it, you certainly could, certainly do that if that was what you wanted to do. So the process for data review is obviously, we de-identified all the data, and then my chief communications officer, who was really my right-hand person on this, she had worked with me in another organization. And so she really understood what I was trying to accomplish and what we were trying to do. So she became really the right-hand person along with our chief HR officer for getting the data, visualizing it, and then sharing it. Initially, she would share it with myself and the chief HR officer before we sent it out to the larger C-suite for review. And that gave me an opportunity to kind of, sit with it a little bit, really kind of formulate some of my questions and thoughts, so that when it came to the C-suite for review, I felt like I was a little bit grounded in it so that I could help kind of in that spot of translation. We had the quantitative data expressed in multiple formats. I'm not sharing any of that with you today, but maybe later or some other time, there might be an opportunity, but I didn't really feel like that was, since I'm not there anymore, and they've given me full permission to talk about it, of course, but I just didn't feel like that was, a place to share it. Our qualitative comments were provided verbatim. So at the senior level, we got to see all of those comments, and some of them were, every now and then you'd get one where you're like, oh my gosh, where did that come from? And it would really trigger folks to, leaders to say, wow, is that about me? Or, everybody would try to start taking it personally. And I'd always kind of go, okay, remember, we've asked for this feedback, and we need to, kind of step back and look at it from that perspective and not really look at it from a personal perspective. Once the C-suite would review the data and start having conversations around what did they see, what were some of the things that surprised them, what were some of the things that they felt like we should be, maybe taking more action around, then we took the next step to share it with our management team. Now, the management team got the quantitative data as it was, for sure, the way we had it, all the different visualized ways of looking at it. But for the management team, what my communications chief did is, between she and I, we created themes. So we would take the qualitative data and then we would kind of put it in these buckets or these themes so that the managers and directors and supervisors could see the themes, but not the verbatim comments. Because some of them you could probably maybe, figure out who they were. So we never wanted that kind of opportunity. So the questions asked of leadership members, once both at the high level and then also as we kind of cascaded it out through the organization, were, how do you feel these results align with what you had expected or anticipated? And especially, once you start collecting data and you have some trend data, every time we do the survey, you have a little bit different level of expectation or anticipation based on, what maybe had happened before. Do any of these results necessitate additional information gathering, or do they create curiosity for you about anything? In other words, is there anything that is showing up either in the quantitative or qualitative that as a leader we should say, wonder what's underneath that? What are some of the ways that we can explore, where that data might be coming from? And then what do you think your fellow leaders should know about these findings and these data? And then finally, what do you think all staff should know in terms about how to hear about the results and how should we communicate that? So those are questions, particularly early on, that we spent a lot of time kind of rumbling around with to kind of find our way so that we were, presenting the data to leaders down from the C-suite and finally out to employees in a way that was meaningful and that there were actions associated with those. And then we would always ask, what are any goals for future results, so that we kind of kept our eye toward that future, really wanting to know, okay, how do we continue to move in this direction while being attentive to what the data is sharing with us? So now the big question, so what? Now what do? You got all this data, what are you going to do with it? So for us, the key goals for the survey process, that we wanted to be consistent and that we were reliably making sure that we were keeping it on that quarterly basis and that annual basis. Now, some quarters it would wibble a little bit, especially during COVID. It might not be exactly in the quarter that we had, the middle of the month or whenever it was, but we were pretty much on time with those quarterly surveys. Like I said, just give or take a few, days or maybe a week or so. And it was really important that we continue to ensure that employees felt safe in giving their answers. And I think this also is reflective of if you're looking at your culture and you've heard about psychological safety and creating that culture of psychological safety. That is really an important element, I think, as you kind of set forward and doing these kind of surveys, is that your employees feel like they're in a safe space and that they have the ability to really share with their authentic voice what they're thinking, and that there's not kind of ramifications or they're going to be hunted down and try to figure out what they're talking about. So that's another piece that becomes really critical, I think, is how you create that cultural kind of energy so that your employees feel safe and they feel valued, that you're asking them for their opinion and their thoughts. And with that comes this responsibility, I think, and accountability, that when you are collecting this data and you are getting this feedback, that you are, the keeper of really important information, and that you're not just collecting it and keeping it from this transactional space of, yep, check that box, we did the employee engagement or satisfaction survey data, but that you're creating this feedback loop so that now that data becomes information for you as leaders to look at what you're going to do to either change or reinforce some of the information that you're getting. And then for us, I think one of the really great things was having this really robust data, this trend data over time, where we could look at quarters, 3-4 years apart. We could look at, were we going through a major, epic conversion, or something that was happening in the organization to kind of help us understand, oh yeah, that's why it went up or that's why it went down. So trend data becomes really important, because if you do it once or twice, it's information and it's important. But I think trend data has so much more value to it than just a one-time kind of snapshot, because that power in the trend data really shows what's happening in the culture, which, as all of you know, changing culture or influencing culture takes a lot of time and energy and effort. And so the satisfaction in employee engagement survey data can really kind of be a proxy, if you will, to show you how you're doing in terms of your culture, how you're trying to create a healthier culture for your workforce. And so, like I mentioned earlier, that we have all of this data that we've gathered over the last 6 years, and I think the part that was really great for me, particularly as the leader, is that overall our results were generally always pretty positive. Very, I think, because I've been in other organizations where it wasn't always the case, but there were always just those really clear areas of strength and then areas of opportunity. And so I think as a leader, and when you're trying to promote this, that you're talking about those opportunities, that when you ask for the feedback, it's not always going to be rainbows and unicorns. Hopefully you get some of that, but you're also going to get some of the areas of, and I try to not frame it up as negativity, but really areas of opportunity that are blind spots almost, that maybe you weren't even aware of. And again, finding those mechanisms to really promote and prompt staff to want to participate, so that you get high numbers, so that your data becomes even more meaningful and also representative, so that over time you are gaining more confidence in what you're learning from the data. And like I said, we only missed one survey, and that was during when COVID first hit. Okay. Whoops. All right. So these are just some of the things that, with sharing the information with staff that I alluded to a little bit before. We wanted to make sure we had this consistent way that we were doing it. So again, after a review of the data at that, initially at that all staff training, we started to look at our other kind of training events and to figure out, okay, how do we use this data to really influence that? The data collected, we always have some, mention or a section in our hot sheet. We have a weekly newsletter or email that goes out to all staff. That's basically, what do you need to know this week? All the kind of things that are the most important, so that there's this consistent expectation of communication from staff. And so the staff then know when the survey data come out, and after it's been kind of gone through all the levels, that then they get this information about what the data show and what kind of things leadership was doing to kind of address that. We also did, I would say this was one of the most important things that I loved doing, was having town halls every time we had a survey data that came out. Prior to COVID, we would do them in person, but as we got bigger, we ended up doing more Zoom, and then COVID of course really moved it into that space. And then, we always ask managers to check in with their direct reports for additional insight on the results. So we ask leaders to have conversations with their staff, their teams, to say, hey, do these data represent what you think, what you're seeing? Are we missing anything? And so those became really powerful conversations and really additional pieces of information. All right, and so now I wanted to share with you some of the initiatives that have come out of the data. And one of the things, like I said at the beginning, not only the initiatives, but the instrument itself, and just how we continue to evolve the instrument itself. So one of the things that came out was that there was this lack of understanding around, how do we get better leaders? How do we get leadership training, et cetera? So out of that, we created a leadership academy, kind of an emerging leaders academy. We restructured the annual employee development and review process to really not only include developmental components, but really have that focus shifted from evaluation and review to really employee development, annual development review. We hired a security guard and upgraded our organizational safety infrastructure. That was really huge. And that was a result, again, of the data that we got from some of the surveys that we had collected. We formed multiple employee-led committees. We have a service excellence committee and a well-being committee. And through those committees, we've initiated several all-staff events and traditions. For example, we have ANHC Spirit Week and Gratitude Week. We started that a couple years ago. The Gratitude Week was just one of the best things that we ever did, and we actually now continue it on a quarterly basis. People loved it so much. Holiday-based events, and these are not things that probably you guys aren't doing yourselves, but a lot of these were brought forward based on some of the information that we were receiving. And then the other thing that happened is through some of these committees, like the Service Excellence Committee, they prompted us to have more questions around how we were doing with both our internal and external customer service. We talked about, becoming an employer of choice. So all of those questions were iterative versions based on the data that we were receiving. And then we added a set of COVID questions in June of 2020 to make sure that the things that we were doing around response and PPE and all of the things that were COVID related, we added that in that space, and we've continued to use those. Hopefully those will go away at some point, but that was really useful and helpful information as well. So wisdom from the journey, and I want to make sure I'm watching my time here, that the satisfaction comments are valuable when used correctly. That is really, for me, the most important piece, is that you really have to understand how you're going to use this and kind of think of the up and down consequences of that. But it's really important to make sure that people know that their information is secure and confidential. We also updated the survey format to allow for more open comments every 5 questions, because initially we just had kind of open at the end, what else do you think, or those questions. So then we started saying, let's group it in questions of 5, so that as they were thinking about comments, it was much more meaningful to have a space to put comments in when they were in kind of relationship with those questions. The other thing is, the more comments that we received and the more insight we gained, it also meant that it took often longer and added some additional complexity and nuance to the overall body of data. And it's not always easy to receive feedback. So this was one of the things, particularly at the executive team, that, we would get this data and overall everything was, it would be really great. But then there'd be like this one comment and somebody would say, that's really about me, I know, and people don't have any idea how hard I work, and, et cetera. So you have to help people understand that to not take it personal, but again, to take it as feedback and to try to understand it. And to try to stay in that space of what I think of as creative versus reactive. So one strong comment from somebody that's really jarring and triggering, and I've seen a few of those as CEO, you have to make sure that you're not going to be reactive and shift an entire strategy based on a single comment, but again, looking at things over time. Employees want to know they were heard, so it's really important to make sure that you're sharing the data, and most importantly, sharing what are you doing now in response to some of the data that they are being heard, and that this is valuable time that they've taken to provide information, and what are you doing about it. And then, like I said, the feedback tool for the town halls has been really, really great. And then finally, I would just kind of close, or I think I'm getting close to the end here. Setting goals and metrics can be hard. Over time, like I said, we'd pick different metrics and we'd try to follow those. And we would have, specific things for managers and directors to kind of be doing. And we'd see the data kind of move and shift and that sort of thing. And those are important. But one of the things that we realized is that there's sometimes so much data that it's like, how do you focus or prioritize? So prior to my leaving, one of the things that we started to look at and we're working on was to really kind of think about creating index to kind of collapse some of the questions into different buckets so that we'd have these different indices. And we were in that process, and I was working with my chief communications officer when I transitioned out at the end of the year, but I'm still working with them on that, because I think it's one of the pieces that could be really helpful in terms of finding more meaningful ways to look at the data, see the data from a leadership perspective, but also for communicating it to employees. So I just want to finish with some ideas for you to reflect on. And I think Suzanne had mentioned a couple of these earlier. How do you think your staff would prefer to hear about survey outcomes and follow-up actions associated with the feedback? What existing organizational communication, channels or ways that you do communication could you integrate these results into, rather than just starting something completely brand new, if you have that opportunity with some channels that already exist? And then what challenges do you think you could come up that could come up in the event that you receive critical feedback of your current strategic direction as an organization? And how can you proactively prepare yourself and your teams to regard critical feedback with what I call humble curiosity? So that is, I'm going to stop sharing. So thank you so much for listening. I know it was a lot of information, but as you might be able to tell, I have such passion around this work because I think it's one of the most really critical things that we can do, and especially now with people leaving organizations and trying to recruit, is how do we use this data to really drive the cultural energy and the cultural norm that we want within an organization. And so I highly value it, and I really appreciate all of you taking time to investigate this and look at it from a place that could benefit your organization. So I'll take questions if there are still time, Suzanne.
There's definitely still time. I'll take it from here. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was so much really great information. Folks are saying it in the chat, and I personally am feeling that way. So again, I know that Tammy and Suzanne said this at the beginning, but for those of you here, feel free to, once the recording is posted, feel free to share with your team the recording so that anyone else who you feel like needs this information on your team can start to engage with it. We do have one question in the chat, and I feel like you did kind of talk about this throughout the presentation, but can you tell us more about what is the difference between employee engagement and staff satisfaction?
Sure, and I was really glad to see that. So again, this is from my perspective and just from my experience of being in different organizations, is that I look at employee engagement as the questions and the energy around what's happening kind of currently in real time. How are people feeling about being engaged, in the workplace at that point in time? I think as of satisfaction questions more as they're not as temporal. They're not going to change as much, kind of in the immediacy as the engagement survey questions that we had. I'm not saying that that's correct or that's validated or scientific. It's just how we chose to kind of divide those two up so that we had a way to better understand the data as it kind of parsed out. But it's not scientific by any means.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions before we move on to wrapping up and talking about homework in the next session? So we've got, what are your thoughts on incentivizing survey completions? I'm concerned that this will lead to a culture, habit, or expectation that one must receive something in return for completing a survey. Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I so appreciate it because we talked about that in the beginning, and I was absolutely like, I personally feel like that's where your opportunity as starting from the top all the way down through your managers and supervisors is creating that culture of psychological safety and the value add that you're creating by having this survey. My personal feeling is, again, it's not scientifically validated, is that if you start with incentivizing for people to do those, it really then becomes more transactional. It really does become check the box, get it done. And the other piece of that is it also creates or disconnects the anonymity, because a lot of times if you're incentivizing, you have to know who that person is, right? So I can't wrap my brain around how you can do it without knowing who people are. So I think it kind of contradicts that ability to have anonymity. And anyway, that's my opinion, whether it's right or not, but that's my thought process around that. But great question.
Thank you so much for sharing. We talked a lot in the last session about like ways you could incentivize it, but I really appreciate hearing from you who've done this and been so successful at it that like, yeah, that even in how you present the doing of the survey is part of creating the culture of the survey. So it's a great thing for us all to learn. Yeah.
And if I could just say one last closing thing, I think I really appreciate the opportunity to share my passion around this. And I think if you can really shift your mindset around the employee engagement survey from a process and a transactional opportunity to really part of the greater transformational work that you want to do around culture, because that's really what you're trying to get at, then you create this space where you're inviting people in to be part of what you're trying to change with them, not to them or for them. So with that, I will close and say thank you. And feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or anything, but thank you. And I'll turn it back over to you, Suzanne.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I mean, the whole thing was wonderful. And that last, I feel like we should get a quote of what you just said written up and framed. And yeah, that was absolutely wonderful. All right, I'm gonna share my screen now and just go over the homework for this session and some next steps. So the homework for this session is this action planning for responding to staff satisfaction survey. So it's a lot like what you did for the previous session, but please read through and answer the questions on the homework assignment and develop an action plan for responding to your staff satisfaction surveys. It outlines the action planning process as well so that you can review that and think about that. Of course, throughout the next week, 2 weeks, yeah, we're doing them every other week. Feel free to reach out to us, Suzanne or Mariah and I, for any assistance, or even if you just want a thought partner to work through anything, we're available and around for that. You can, of course, post on the discussion board. We highly encourage that to engage with your peers. And again, we'll check the discussion board, so we'll be able to see if you've reached out there, but you can email us as well. This is just, this slide just shows the next part of that homework assignment, which again will be available on the discussion board. So you can do your action planning here. This is a reminder about how to get to the discussion board. You've seen it before, but just a reminder, feel free to check it out, post anything there. And then again, the homework assignment, the slides from today's presentation, and the recording from today's session will be posted there soon. And then thank you all for joining us. As always, we really appreciate you being here. We have 2 more sessions in this learning collaborative. One is Wednesday, March 6th, and the next is Wednesday, March 16th. So we'll be getting back on that Wednesday schedule. You can always check out other training opportunities we have coming up, of course, on the training section of our website. And then we've already gone over questions, but of course, if you have any others about any of the logistics, feel free to put them in chat or unmute yourselves now. And as a reminder, we really appreciate the if you filling out the evaluation. So Mariah's about to launch the evaluation, and if you could fill that out, like Suzanne said at the top of the session, we really appreciate it as people who are putting on these sessions and wanting to make our training and technical assistance useful to you, because we know your time is valuable. And then of course, our funder also really appreciates when we have those results available. So thank you for those of you who are filling out the poll. I can see we have, I think 7 folks have filled it out. So we'll leave it up a little bit longer to allow folks to continue putting it in. But again, Tammy, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Have a great rest of
Thank you
your
so
day.
much, Tammy.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Tammy.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Let us know if you need anything.